Assignment 3.2, Billy White. Arousal. Arousal can be defined as the intensity of behavior in reference to the degree of emotional energy that is felt in different situations. There is two main types. There's cognitive, which is the psychological aspect or the mental changes, for example, nervousness, and there's somatic, which is the physiological changes in the body, e.g., increased heart rate. Arousal can be both useful and detrimental to performance, which emphasizes how much must be considered and understood by performers to optimize their performance. There are many theories that try to explain arousal in relation to sport performance. Drive theory. The first explanation for arousal links to performance is drive theory, which states there's a strong positive relationship between performance and arousal, which means that arousal increases, performance increases. It also states that when arousal is evident, the dominant response behavior, which is the motor program that's already learned, is likely to emerge. The performance depends on the richness of the skill in that situation. A novice learner will perform badly if aroused. For example, if you are new to football and you are asked to take a penalty in the cup final, it's most likely that you would miss as you aren't experienced in that situation and don't know how to utilize the arousal. However, if you're an expert in that situation and you have experience taking penalties lots of times, it's likely you'll perform well as your dominant response will emerge, which will be good, and you will optimize your arousal. A criticism of this theory is that it's very common for world-class athletes to crumble and not perform in situations where they have high arousal. A good example of this could be Liverpool's former goalkeeper Karius in the Champions League final 2018, in which he made two huge mistakes which cost him the game. The situation was monumental and there was lots of pressure on him to perform. His main mistake was when Gareth Bale shot straight at him and he let it go through his hands into the goal. This goes against the theory as he didn't perform better with high arousal. Inverted U theory. Inverted U theory, devised by Yerkes and Dodson in 1908, follows the basic concept that arousal level and performance/motivation will increase up to an optimum point at which arousal will keep rising and performance will decrease. It suggests if you're under-aroused, for example daydreaming or just not focusing, it will prove negative to your performance as you don't care enough to reach the full potential. For example, in a football match, if you're not focusing, you may not be in the correct position or have poor reaction time, which decreases your team's likeliness of winning and therefore your own performance. Your optimal performance is reached when your arousal is at a moderate level, when you are motivated and willing to invest your full focus but not too over-aroused. For example, in a boxing bout, if you're at your optimal level, you can focus, therefore choosing the right punches. You could slip punches, which would just lead to ultimately giving you a better chance and getting more points and winning. When you're over-aroused or over-motivated, your performance decreases as you lose the capacity of full focus and you may become hyper-vigilant, therefore prohibiting effective performance of motor skills. The state you can come to when over-aroused can be described as a blind panic. For example, again using boxing, if you're over-aroused, you may become angry and swing recklessly, leaving you vulnerable to be punched, therefore decreasing your performance. Personality and the level of experience in the specific skills will greatly affect the amount of arousal you experience. For example, if you're very relaxed or a lazy person, you may be more likely to be under-aroused in a sporting situation. And if you have lots of experience in a sporting scenario, for example running one-on-one with a goalkeeper, you'll know what to do and therefore perform with moderate arousal as you know that's what the performance needs. Some skills require high arousal and some don't. This can depend on whether it's a gross skill, which means it requires a lot of power, and simple, which means not a lot of skill is needed, or if it's complex, which means when the performer must process lots of information and make lots of decisions, and if it's fine, so that'll be small coordinated muscle movements. For example, a rugby tackle will need lots of arousal as it's a gross and simple skill, and in contrary, a golf putt will need little arousal as it's complex and fine in regards to skill. A criticism of the inverted U theory is the fact that it's very unlikely that there will actually be a smooth decline in performance as presented on the graph, and it's a lot more likely that the decline is instant and sharp. if somatic and cognitive arousal is high. For example, if you're running through on goal and your heart rate is very high, which is a somatic aspect, and you become very anxious, which is a cognitive aspect, it's more likely your performance will instantly drop to its lowest instead of slowly decreasing. Catastrophe theory. The last explanation for arousal in sports is catastrophe theory, which is very similar to inverted U theory in that it has an optimal level of arousal and the concept that the performance will go down after arousal rises above the optimal level. So as previously stated, catastrophe theory suggests that somatic arousal rises along with performance until it hits the optimal performance level, which has differing levels of arousal for different sports. For example, the optimal level for diving will be low arousal, and for boxing it may be in the middle, as you arguably need more aggression. After the optimal level, it's argued the performance will then drop immediately to its lowest level, and this drop will be because of a catastrophe that takes place, for example, missing a penalty. A criticism of this theory is the fact that some high-class athletes can bounce back from a catastrophe to their optimal performance. For example, Harry Kane once missed a penalty in a very intense moment of the game and then came back a few minutes later to score a penalty, which argues that he came back to his optimal performance. Anxiety. Anxiety can be defined as a negative experience of stress and is commonly caused by extreme worry or apprehension. There are many factors that can affect anxiety in sport, which could be fear of injury, threat to self-esteem, threat of letting down, or even fear of competition, etc. There are two main forms of anxiety: cognitive anxiety, which is the mental component. This is commonly linked to worry, apprehension, and many more psychological aspects. And there's also somatic anxiety, which is the physical component, which is associated with the bodily responses, for example, increased heart rate, sweating, and many more. The cognitive anxiety can occur at any time. It can happen days before a performance. However, somatic normally only occurs in the moments coming up to the event. For example, walking up to taking a penalty, your heartbeat may drastically rise more than when you heard you might be taking one. In addition to somatic and cognitive anxiety, there are two other forms known as the second dimension of anxiety. These two are trait anxiety and state anxiety. Trait anxiety is an innate trait to perceive certain situations as threatening. It's said to be a stable part of one's personality, which means it's unlikely to change. Someone with high trait anxiety in sport would be someone who is anxious in things Someone with high trait anxiety in sport would be someone who is anxious of things even if they have high skills and experience in that field. For example, a football player may be very skilled in penalties, but if they get one, they will perceive the situation as threatening and will focus on the negative, which ultimately may cause them to miss as they're so anxious. State anxiety refers to the anxiety which is a result of the extremity of the situation. It's their immediate condition in any situation, basically. This is normally a cognitive response, and some which differ from trait anxiety, in which you perceive many situations as threatening. We found evidence of state anxiety in our class when we were asked to rate our anxiety levels after hearing that we'll be doing a penalty shootout. The fact some people who weren't nervous when doing them and not in a pressure-inducing situation were now rating themselves as anxious for these shows evidence of state anxiety as the situation affected the extremity of their anxiety. All the different aspects of anxiety can affect performance individually, but in unity they can prove detrimental to performance. For example, cognitive anxiety and somatic anxiety, when both at high levels, can easily cause a catastrophe, which I've mentioned before in the catastrophe theory of arousal. The theory states that catastrophe will occur when too aroused, which will decrease the performance to its lowest level. For example, if you're sweating with very high heart rate and high blood pressure, which is somatic effects, and then you add being nervous and very apprehensive to it, which is the cognitive anxiety, this could lead to the performer mentally breaking down or physically reducing the body's performance, which could lead to a lack of focus, worse reactions, or more. This would prove detrimental to performance. There are many anxiety management techniques which can be used to suppress or fully eradicate somatic and cognitive anxiety. These include breathing, which could take away some of the components of somatic anxiety, like increased heart rate. There is relaxation techniques, which could be counting to 10. These are all somatic anxiety management techniques. There's also rational thinking, selective attention, mental imagery, and thought stopping, which could be cognitive anxiety management techniques. Many of these can be very useful when used correctly. For example, if you count to 10 and take deep breaths if you're anxious before taking a penalty, it may reduce both somatic and cognitive anxiety as it brings your heart rate down, which allows more efficient oxygen supplies to go to the working muscles, which is the somatic effect of it. However, it can also help nervousness, which is the cognitive side of it. This ultimately all helps to help the performance. However, there are also problems with the management techniques. The main one being that it's very difficult to find time to execute them in a game situation. For example, if you can't rationally start thinking and counting to 10 when the ball is being passed around you. Another criticism could be the fact that some performers won't usually want to use these techniques for many reasons, for example, laziness. Also, some management techniques require specialist equipment which may not be available for everyone. For example, one technique is practice, which can be difficult to recreate due to money. An example of this could be a dive, and you may not be able to practice diving if you haven't got sufficient money. Stress. Stress is a psychological state that's produced by adverse or demanding circumstances. Stress can have somatic and cognitive effects on the body and can prove detrimental to sports performance. The source of stress is referred to as the stressor, which may be conflict, competition, frustration, or injury. It's been proven stress has very negative implications long-term for one's body, mentally and physically. However, we mustn't forget that stress can be beneficial to performance. This is called eustress. The process of stress involves three parts. The stressor, which is the environmental changes that cause a stressful response. For example, being told you're going to take a penalty in the cup final. The stress response, which is the physiological changes that occur due to stress, e.g., could be the release of adrenaline or increased heart rate. And finally, the stress experience, which is the way that we perceive the situation, which would be being anxious or nervous, etc. There are two main types of stress, eustress and de-stress. Eustress is the good form of stress that can give you a feeling of fulfillment or challenge. This can be very useful in increasing skill and focus in sport as it can increase intrinsic motivation. An example of this could be in the current NBA basketball playoffs, in which some players are being matched up against players which have a lot more skill and are physically more dominant than them. The less dominant players may experience eustress as they see it as a challenge, so will look to perform their best and prove themselves. Distress is the bad form of stress, which is said to be a representation of extreme anxiety, nervousness, apprehension, or worry, as a potential perceived inability to perform to meet the demands of the situation. An example of this could be a 100-meter final, when they might be against very good opponents, and then they may believe that they haven't got the potential or skill to win, which will distress them, therefore making them anxious and nervous, which could decrease performance. There are four main causes of stress. Internal, which are normally self-induced, like illness, being overly self-critical, lack of sleep, and like cognitive aspects of it. External, these are causes from external factors that you can't necessarily control. For example, noisy and quiet environments, big life events, which could be a loss of a close relative. Occupational causes, which are a result of your job or school. For example, you could be dissatisfied with your job, you could have bad pay or too much work, etc. Personal reasons. This could be stress from significant others, which could be arguments with siblings, disagreements with partners, etc.